So today we're doing my most requested video, which is how to make a bullet-resistant molded RedHood chest plate like we have here. Now the one that we're building today isn't quite the same as the one that I showed a few years ago. This one is actually a nanoparticle infill, making it more bullet resistant. It allows it to be thinner. It is lighter as well. So this one comes in just under 3 pounds when we're making today, where this one is about 2.4 pounds. But this one is a lot more challenging to make. It's a lot more challenging to degas properly before it solidifies after that infusion process. And then the infill that I used in this is a very similar infill that I used on my panel that was stopping the 300 Winchester Magnum, that sniper obliterator panel, whatever you'd like to call it. So what we're doing today is a lot more affordable, it's a lot easier to make, much more repeatable, and it still did stop multiple Full Metal Jacket 9mm rounds with pretty low backface deformation, certainly a lot better than a soft vest. So you can apply these techniques to other materials like carbon fiber or Kevlar, but I just like fiberglass for its stability and availability as well. So Kevlar, for example, I found to do worse when in epoxy than the fiberglass. Kevlar, when it's in the fabric form, is able to take advantage of its incredible tensile strength and deflect and then begin catching the round, so you get this stretch and the tensile forces can really kick in. Whereas when you lock it in an epoxy matrix, the bullet tends to more punch through those fibers because they're not able to deflect, and then you also get more delamination in the Kevlar than the fiberglass. So I find that these actually make much stronger backer panels, and the Kevlar I like to use just a few layers draped in front or sewed in front and pulled tight, because that fabric does a really great job of letting the round ball up on the surface as it tries to break through the really hard fiberglass backer and catch the round in the Kevlar. So this actually doesn't have the insert I'm holding right here. This is just a few layers of soft Kevlar, which this just snaps behind. We've got the original plate here along with the mold that I used to create it. Now this is just 3D printed, and if you want to make this exact mold yourself, I'll be putting this file up on my Patreon. Just go from home to the collections tab, scroll down to that collection, and then download the file. And if you want to make it bigger or smaller, you can simply scale it to fit your needs. And then for those alternative builds, I'll be including another model just for you. Now all you have to do is transfer the shape to a flat surface. I just used a piece of fabric, traced it out, and then transferred that to a piece of paper. Now you just need a rough backer to place your plate on to support it while you're putting the fiberglass on it. I just used a piece of concrete, basically just jiggle it down until it's a firm backer. Now I did end up splitting this thin 3D print, but thankfully I had another prototype backer from a different plate that was close enough, just glued them together so it was nice and sturdy. You will want some PVA wax. This is going to help for mold release, and then get some good heavy gloves. I only had medium duty. Heavy duty are preferred. Then you're just gonna brush on all of the PVA wax onto your mold to make sure that we have a good mold release so nothing sticks to this. Ideally, you have a heat gun on high fan, low heat, but you can totally get away with just a hairdryer here to be able to actually dry and cure that faster. Then you're just gonna repeat this process. I like to do each coat in a different direction for about 3 coats just to make sure I get in between all of those print lines. Next, you'll want some heavy plastic cups. These are cheap. This is what we'll mix the resin in. You'll just throw those away once you're done, and then some aluminum foil. Also get some vacuum bags. Plain old cheap vacuum bags for storage work just fine for this. So I like getting glass stir rods. I mean, pretty much any stir rod will work. This just minimizes the bubbles that you introduce while mixing the epoxy. So this is an example of large bubbles forming in that matrix going to medium-sized bubbles to very small bubbles. Each of these greatly reduces the strength of your epoxy. Another alternative is degassing the epoxy, which is essentially necessary when you're mixing in nanoparticles. You're gonna introduce air. You wanna degas it, cut that foam off so you have a nice clean base to begin building with. The problem is that you're kind of in a race against time. The problem with epoxy is it's an exothermic reaction. So it's gonna begin heating up, and then as it heats up, it speeds up the reaction. As the reaction speeds up, it heats up more, so on and so forth. So you have to do it in small batches. Now when doing your setup, it doesn't have to be very complicated. You could just get away with a straight up 1/2 inch hose to that adapter. I like to be able to see the pressure that I'm getting and make sure that I don't have any holes in the vacuum bags. Sometimes you can end up tearing these bags, and it's great to be able to have that pressure gauge to ensure that you have full suction maintained. Now shockingly, the connections for a vacuum hose to a vacuum bag were like 30 to 40 bucks for a metal one. I couldn't find anything cheaper. So I just modeled and 3D printed my own design, just include a neoprene washer, and this is easily secured into a 1/2 inch tube. So just take your hose end, put a neoprene washer on top of your bag, and then just push them together, and this works great. Again, this will also be up in that same folder on Patreon for you to download yourself. So the best epoxy I've found is from West Systems. It's the 105 resin with the actual 205 fast hardener. I've actually found that this one performs a little bit better than some of the other options. And the best fiberglass for this is 18-ounce woven roving. It's good ballistic strength and is pretty easy to be able to mold into shapes. You're gonna want also a cutting wheel and hard back surface. Okay, but how did we pick this fiberglass? So thankfully this armor we're doing is homogeneous. It only has a couple materials and processes to optimize. So let's say simply through trial and error that I already know the best epoxy, so we can make that constant. Then let's also say that the final layup or the panel thickness is also constant. We could just say 1/4 inch. So let me now figure out the optimal weight of fiberglass to use. In this case, the weight, which is ounces per yard squared, correlates to the diameter of those fibers that are going to be locked into this epoxy matrix. So we could examine 3 different weight classes. We could observe their impact resistance and get a gist for this graph. So what we see are these variables at play between lower weights having more layers but each being weaker, with more individual connection points between the weave, but because of that, those nodes in that finalized epoxy matrix are much smaller. So there is a balance to be struck which may yield a graph like we're seeing here. But we didn't get here just by hitting the right set of materials. We could also examine different weaves. We could add in other materials, like let's see how carbon fiber or Kevlar, which I've also tested, how those perform. Then we could start doing fillers. Which type of filler? Each type of filler could then spin off its own graph, like we see denoted in the bottom left here, with that third dimension stretching off as a percentage by weight of that infill that we've chosen. Now, what if we add those lattices like I have in my super armor? Well, now we have different types of structures, so we can again spin off different graphs per type of structure, and each of them having 5 or 6 additional ratios to investigate. So then right there, we already have a hyperdimensional problem to optimize. But then there's also process variables and so on, leading this to be extremely complicated. And that's when you start having to do theoretical research and try to infer what's going to happen, what's best, so you can really narrow down your test set to get meaningful data from that to make future conjectures from. But preventing us from diving off into that deep end, let's back up again and go with, we're going to use 18-ounce fiberglass. That works well and it's great, easy to use. Now you're going to want to clip any extra strands you have to keep this from unraveling. It does have a propensity to do that. So lay out your fiberglass and then use a Sharpie to trace out your templates. None of these have to be very precise. When you're laying the fiberglass, it will shift and you're just going to have to cut off extra at the end of the process. So don't worry too much about being precise here. So make sure that half of them are perpendicular to the weave and the other half are at about roughly 45 degrees of that weave as well. You might notice that the patterns laid out here are a little bit weird. That was just me avoiding holes or irregularities in the fiberglass because I wanted to leave those out of the layup. Then you're just going to proceed to cut them with your cutting wheel. Make sure you don't twist or deform the fabric. At this point, you want to be very careful with each of them. The reason that we cut half of these at 90 degrees with the weave and the other half at 45 degrees with the weave is because it allows it to be much stronger. So basically as the bullet's tunneling in, it's hitting this material in alternating orientations, taking advantage of tensile strength in each, so you end up with a much stronger panel in the end. And then I just take out my heavy aluminum foil. It's good for me to be able to transfer it to the mold later on. Then you're just gonna want some good peel ply. This is gonna go on top of the part and give it a great texture. Once we have everything all laid out here, all of my fiberglass is set in alternating weaves already, and notice the orientation marks. This is to make sure that I don't get them backwards because top to bottom, they're pretty similar. So once I have everything again laid out, because the epoxy will start hardening right away, you want to be ready to just get going. I've got my mold set up with my peel ply ready to go, my vacuum bag set, and so we're gonna just start mixing up our epoxy. Now all you have to do is 1 pump of resin to 1 pump of the hardener. I like to do 5 pumps each. That's about the ideal size. That small batch keeps it from going into thermal runaway, easy to work with, and then you want to be really careful with mixing it that you don't introduce a bunch of bubbles. So you'll notice that when I finish this, it's a very smooth, bubble-free mix. I then lay down a thick base layer because I like to do very wet layups, especially with doing ballistic armor. You want to make sure that there are absolutely no spots that are dry. You want this to be really well pressed. Make sure you get in all the crevices, really smooth it out well, and continuing doing this layer by layer, laying each piece on top. Careful to not introduce bubbles and making sure there's ample material between each. So you notice that I like to use my glass stir rod here. I'll basically hold it up between my fingers just high enough that I can carefully roll that rod across the top, smoothing out the epoxy. If you push it down too hard, you're gonna move too much epoxy. You wanna leave a thin layer there. Once I've done 4 to 5 layers, it might not look like it, but I'm actually putting a lot of pressure on this rolling pin and it's kind of forcing it to move because I don't want to make all the layers slip away from each other. I'm just pushing it down and rolling it carefully. Then we can move our mold into place and then drape our layup on top of that and press it down. The reason that I did this on a flat surface first is to make sure that I've got a really strong backer, because if you do the layup on just a plain aluminum foil with the fiberglass, I found that it tends to slip around a lot more, your resin tends to run, it's a lot harder to get that first base going. You're just gonna have to work it a fair bit because these are about 4 layers thick, carefully put pressure. But once that's done, then you're good to continue laying up all your other pieces as you did before, but you're mostly just doing handwork now of carefully spreading it around and pushing it into place. Now you're just gonna lay your peel ply cloth on that. Doesn't matter which side you use. Lay it on there, make sure it's as wrinkle free as possible and smooth it out. Then I get my breather cloth, also called bleeder cloth. This is basically just a sponge that's going to compress as you suck the vacuum, and it's gonna make sure that air can flow across the part and ensure that epoxy can ooze up from that peel ply and get absorbed into this. You can also get away with a cheaper alternative like paper towels, but you'll just need a lot of them to make sure you can really get a lot of breathability there. Then take this whole layup, put it inside the vacuum bag, and I like to put a little bit of extra paper towels below the port to make sure that air can continue to flow into the vacuum that I'm drawing. And then I just lifted the part underneath to make sure that the bag was pressed up under the underside of this layup. Also make sure that your port is a couple inches from the edge of the part to make sure you can maintain a flat seal as that vacuum finalizes. Now apply your shop vac to get the vacuum. You'll notice that it did draw a vacuum. You can see some of the epoxy going through, but I'm gonna attach my vacuum pump and you're gonna notice that it does indeed cause a stronger vacuum. You see more of this epoxy being pulled out and fully saturating that bleeder cloth. So at this point, it is still soft. So it's a good time to make any sort of last minute changes or adjustments. And you're gonna wanna also make sure you flatten out those edges so it's easy to cut off later on. Now experts are gonna say, you didn't measure out your epoxy, that's why you have so much excess. Yes, but I kind of haven't really cared enough and I've always been able to get it off with enough manpower. So if you want to have an easier time getting off this peel ply, maybe do a little bit less epoxy, but I just wanna make sure I've got plenty when I do my build. So everything looks good. We're just gonna let this sit for 24 hours before unpackaging it. Once we pull it out, we're gonna start with pulling off the backer panel. I just used a wedge and prying to be able to pop this off. And then you'll notice some of that wax is already loose there, and it did its job. It protected any of the seeping epoxy from the aluminum foil from getting on and sticking to the part. Next, you're gonna wanna put this in a vise. I like to put a little bit of tape on it just to make sure I don't mar up my part. Crank it down, and then this is the part where you're really gonna have to yank on this if you did as much epoxy as I did, where I like to just use some pliers and begin really wrenching on this thing, and then just peeling it off in large chunks. The peel ply is pretty amazing. It really does a fantastic job of making sure those pores are small enough that you can detach it. What's really fighting me here is that breather cloth being soaked in the epoxy, so it itself is kind of like a flexible panel. But yeah, just keep on wrenching at it and eventually you'll get it. So we can already see that really nice texture. You can use a rotary wheel on a Dremel, but I like using my multi-tool a lot better. It's way faster and easier to use, especially for these 1/4-inch panels. And this is when I switch over to my Dremel with a sanding head just to round off all the edges and make it look more polished. Then just use some isopropyl alcohol to wipe off all the dust to make sure it's nice and clean and ready for paint. Now upon weighing this panel, we see that it is still less than 3 pounds, so 2.94 pounds, which is still absolutely comparable to the nanoparticle plate coming in at 2.36 pounds. I'm just using a gray metallic spray paint here. Of course, you can use whatever you want for your cosplays. So there is your finished plate. You can see that peel ply gave it a really awesome texture. It holds paint extremely well, looks great. You're able to get those contours. And this is the part where I say, don't try this at home. Making cosplay parts is one thing, but shooting them is something else. And so I'm doing that for entertainment purposes and educational purposes only. Don't try to replicate. You can actually start filming now, I think.
Already filming.
Perfect. And I stopped it, so it's there. You can see the paint just flicked off, but a little tiny dent. So we're good. Full metal jacket, NATO, close range. Number 2. Stopped. I'm gonna repeat. I'm just gonna keep shooting this, just to show how many shots you can take. Stopped. A little bit bigger dent, but still stopped it right there.
Mm-hmm. Right in the middle.
Yep, right in the middle. Right next to it again, so we're hitting this crease right here. Also stopped it twice, so there's just nothing here but just paint chips and stuff. Stopped. No penetration. stopped again. Just deflection. And then show the plate there. You've got those existing 6. No penetrations. All right. Ooh, that's right next to the last one. So let's confirm. We're close. Oh, we're good. Still good. Oh wait, nope. There's a failure right here. So we got one, and it broke through here, which was in this area. Interesting. So it actually went through right there. But still got a lot more stoppage there. What we're gonna do is we're gonna switch over now to the 10 millimeter. Good fly. Oof. Went right here. Yeah. So don't get shot with a 10 millimeter.
Yeah.
As soon as I saw the wood fly, I was like, okay,
Yeah.
that got it. So thanks guys for watching. If you have any questions about the build process, post them below. I'm happy to answer them to the best of my ability. I try to read all the comments, but a lot can come in. And I'll see you guys in my next video.